Sometimes it's in the extreme examples that these principles are more clearly understood. Not that all of us have to go to those extremes, or at least not in every incarnation, we never know. But when we see the power and potential of human consciousness compared to the sort of average way that people live, then it gives us a way to measure our own actions and a way to always be able to tell which way is forward. Sometimes it's actually more confusing than you would think it would be, to be able to tell what is expansive and what is actually contractive, especially when our own sneaky preferences get involved there. I was remembering a very dramatic story about a man named Richard Wurmbrand. Some of you know about him, others of you don't. Swami Kriyananda was very inspired by him and put us in touch with his teaching. Reverend Wurmbrand was a Jewish man who converted to Christianity, and so he lived in Romania, and he lived at the time, he was an adult at the time of World War II, so he's undoubtedly off the planet by now. So first he was Jewish, and then when the Nazis came into Romania, he got to be persecuted as a Jew, and he lived through that, and then he became a Christian, and when the communists came in, he got to be persecuted as a Christian. Some people really sign up for a lot in one incarnation. And when the communists came and took over Romania right after the war, it wasn't obvious at first exactly what was going to happen. But religion is the enemy of communism because communism disregards the value of human life, and spirituality values everyone equally as a child of God, whatever the theology. So Christianity became quite the enemy for the communist regime, and they started removing legitimate priests and pastors from their churches and putting in individuals who were simply instruments of the government. And Richard had a wife named Sabina, who was as dedicated as he was to the spiritual path in their Christian way. And then all the communist leaders, the government leaders, called a big meeting, a big public meeting, and demanded that all the Christian pastors and priests come to that meeting. And by threat or by appealing to pure selfishness, they had managed to get some of the priests and pastors to stand up and speak in favor of communism and against Christianity. And then all the others had to sit and listen in their families. And so this was going on, and Sabina turned to her husband sitting in the audience and urgently said to him, "Somebody must wipe this sin off of the face of Jesus," is how she put it, because his own pastors were declaring against him, and somebody had to stand up and say otherwise. And Richard turned to Sabina and said, "If I stand up in front of all these people, you will no longer have a husband," meaning the consequences to him would be absolute. She, in her extraordinary courage, said to him, "If you do not stand up, I will no longer have a husband." So he did. And of course, a tremendous persecution began, which subsequently put him into prison for many years, eventually put her into prison. All of these stories, he tells the story in the book called Tortured for Christ, which I think if they did market research would not be a really popular title. But it was a true story. And hers, she wrote a book called The Pastor's Wife. So if you have a very stiff spine and are inspired by extreme examples, I recommend both these books. Now, Richard, that book is the story, and he wrote other books. He used to lie alone in his seclusion, we'll call it that. That's not what they actually call it when they put you there. I can't remember what they call it when they put you alone. Solitary confinement, right. He spent many months, even years, in very, very dire circumstances, and he kept himself going by every night he would conduct a complete church service. And he just all by himself in a whisper, he would do all the prayers and all the songs, and then he would give sermons, and he gradually memorized his sermons, and then eventually he wrote them all down and published them all in a book. I mean, he just kept himself going. But at one particular point, he was really pressed by the sadists who had him imprisoned. It doesn't really matter what your theology is. You know, you either love God or you don't. You either serve people or you don't. You work against people's well-being if that's how you feel. When Ananda was severely persecuted through the legal profession, and this one amazingly driven lawyer decided that his life mission was to destroy Ananda, and he worked steadfastly at it for many, many years. And he unfortunately was not stupid, so he was evil, but he was also intelligent. Often evil can be quite intelligent. And at one certain point, Swami just said to him very directly, he said, this was all modern, this is not Richard Wurmbrand, this is Swami Kriyananda. He said, I don't know what you're like in your personal life, but in your professional life, you're a sadist. He said, you became a lawyer because it gave you the opportunity to hurt people, which is what you really want to do. It was a very powerful exchange. It wasn't mild like that. Swami said later, God compelled me to say it. He said, I couldn't have stopped myself if I had tried. So we find throughout history, present history notwithstanding, that people have needs. And they have needs, they in the sense that they need experiences, we need experiences in order to learn certain lessons. And those lessons are, who am I? What is eternally real? Where does suffering come from, and what brings me happiness? And we go in and out of physical bodies. And we go to the astral world for a time, and then we reincarnate again, and we become a baby, and we start acting out. Master said so interestingly, if you define life entirely in physical terms, and if you believe that consciousness is the result of brain activity, he said, when you begin to die and your brain begins to die, you feel obligated to go unconscious. I love that phrase. You feel obligated to go unconscious, because if I don't have a brain, I can't be aware of anything. So many people die and they just go to sleep, literally. And Master said they don't even really wake up in the astral world. The astral world for them is sort of like, as he put it, a gray dream. They can't really see the astral world because the vibration of it is too subtle, and their own awareness just can't go there. So they rest. They kind of get a little breather. And he said they don't really become conscious again until they're babies in a physical body. And then it all makes sense to them, and they start waking up and beginning to do it again. If we're more subtle, especially if we have meditated and have experienced the fact that there are many levels of consciousness beyond thought and brain, or even if we have any powerful faith, even without that much experience that tells us there's a realm beyond this one, when our physical body begins to die, we're able to move up into that realm. Even if you weren't spiritual, many artists, musicians, creative people, nonetheless they've lived on a non-physical realm. So when the physical passes away, they can go somewhere. Even if they go to the scientific university and learn more about what they're going to bring back to this world. We have all those different dimensions in us. So when we're in the astral world again, we're not free. We still have the whole pattern of the chakras, all those different vibrations of understanding. And we have many unlearned lessons for most of us that are going to require a physical body to go through again. Whether they're sensual desires, sexual desires, smoking, drinking, exclusive love, athleticism, whatever it might be, medicine. It can be many different things that require that we be back in this world. Or we need the opportunity, we have evil intentions. And we desire to have power over people. Or we're very confused and think that if we can inflict pain on other people, that somehow that will give us the power and the security that we're seeking. If you just look around the planet right now, it's quite inexplicable if you only take your template, if I only take my template of what's true and paste it on people around me, I can't understand why they're behaving the way they're behaving. But they're working with a wholly different vibration and what they need to experience to find out the truth about things. It's wildly varied on a planet like this. This is a planet in which, especially increasingly, we have great good and we also have increasingly great evil. And every so often those two come together. Coming back to Richard Wurmbrand in his cell there, people who had incarnated to be sadistic and have power over people, and who, for some reason or another, needed to act against their own interests in really acting against spiritual people. And someone who was there, Richard himself, to test himself to the absolute limit. What are the limits of my own ability? That was the question his soul asked before he incarnated and came into that place. What are the limits of my ability to see and feel and rejoice in the presence of God, no matter how profound the challenge to that belief? Now, if you just consider that in the abstract, that's a very good thing to work on, isn't it? Because we might think that we have a certain degree of strength within us, but we don't really know till we're tested. This is when we're raising children or educating children thoughtfully. Part of the most important part of what we do is we bring them up to the edge of challenge, and then we help them understand how they can move through that challenge. And what is the greatest victory is not when you got the medal for showing up, but when you got the medal because you really did stick with it. And that satisfaction of earned success, which is so exhilarating, what is the limit of that? Everything in this world is directional. And when you see some directional victory and celebrate that, can you imagine what the victory would be if, and if, and if, and if? People take on in this world the most unbelievable challenges. I've read many mountain climbing books. I think I finally got settled on that one, and I don't really do it anymore. But, people dragging themselves to the top of Everest or Annapurna or K2 or whatever any of those mountains are, just an unbelievable sacrifice of everything for the exhilaration of actually having done it. Professional athletes, great artists, all of those. So how much greater then if we ourselves say, what is my capacity for constant attunement to God? And what could he throw at me that could take it away from me? So Richard Wurmbrand finds himself in this cell, and because the guards don't have anything to do except torment the prisoners, they decide to torment him. And they start tormenting him by making him walk around and around in a circle in this very small cell, which is not large. He's all by himself. And by the various means that you can exert against a person in such circumstances, by the grace of God, never in this lifetime have I experienced it, but I think we've all been there. I hope to God we don't go there, but if that's what he wants. So Richard is being forced, hour after hour, to just walk like this. And he tells the story in this book of all the levels of resistance and rebellion. And because the circumstance was, there was absolutely nothing in the circumstance except himself and his own mind and this force that was making him do what he didn't want to do. And he thought about his wife, he thought about all he'd sacrificed for Jesus, he thought about his church, all the people he'd helped, he thought about his conversion, just on, and all of it was against. Why? And then it came into his mind that if Jesus was whom he always felt and knew that Jesus was, his best friend, his teacher, his guru, his savior, which is such a beautiful word, his savior, how could this be happening unless Jesus himself willed it for him. And so suddenly, the circumstances were exactly the same. He was still being forced in this impossible way, but it wasn't any longer these sadistic guards who were making him do it. It was his Savior who was asking him to. And he describes in his book how absolutely nothing changed and absolutely everything changed. Because now, every time he completed a circuit, he felt Jesus with him, enjoying it, delighting with him, and he became, instead of reluctant, he became eager. You know, Master talks in his teachings about the tremendous difference between willpower and willingness. How many things are possible if we have the willpower to accomplish them, but whenever we're accomplishing something by willpower, there's always underneath it, isn't there, that little bit of, well, darn it, if I have to do it, I will do it. And look at me, I'm strong enough and I can. But the implication is, if things were different, I wouldn't have to do this. But of course, anything we do by willingness, by the very word, it's like, oh boy, this is what we get to do right now. And Swami tells many different stories, and you can think of them from your own life. The one Swami was often told was coming home exhausted from work to a very messy house and hardly having the energy to rinse out a glass to drink some water, and just falling into bed. And then the phone rings, and there you are with some long-lost friend who's in town just for one night who invites you out, and you're out the door, and it's 2 a.m. before you even remember how tired you were. And now we all have experiences like that, isn't that so? We're just a shift of our thinking. But we rarely, thank God, are put into circumstances where the natural inclination is so different than the heart, than what God is asking of us. But unfortunately, the spiritual teachings always keep coming back, and the Bhagavad Gita talks about it today, desire. Desire it is that is always confusing us. And it's not desire in the sense of the pureness of the heart desiring to give. It's locking ourselves into this thought that this is how it has to be, or else I'm unhappy. Just as simple as that. I mean, Richard Wurmbrand started his saga as a Christian started when his wife, and not necessarily that he even needed the goading, but he might have been resisting out of concern for her. But what is happening now, she said to him, is so evil that there will never be any joy in our lives after this if we allow this evil to stand. And knowing completely what they were sacrificing, they walked into it. Now, very interesting, many years later, Richard Wurmbrand was released from prison and ransomed to the West. He was bought out of Romania. And he and his wife, I believe, also came to Grass Valley, which is right near Ananda village, and gave a program at a church there, one of the churches of whatever denomination he was. And because we were so excited to go see him, Swami Kriyananda and about 40 of us went to see him. And it was the most fascinating architecture because it was this huge church and they had a kind of pulpit in the center, kind of under an archway. And so there were 2 full rooms. Like one side was the fellowship hall and one side was the chapel. It was just the way the church was designed. And there were so many of us that we filled one full side of it. And then the church members filled the other full side of it. And Richard Wurmbrand stood in the middle and he would talk to this side and then he would talk to this side. And it was so astonishing to me. He'd turn to the church members and he'd talk about the Bible and these very, his theology was predictable. And he talked about the very basis of Christianity and all of this. Then he turned to this side and he talked about the infinite spirit and, how God resides in all of us. And then he'd turn back and talk about our personal Savior. And he just went back and forth like this. It was not anything deliberate, but he could just feel it. Because even though he had this way of life, he had transcended everything. And now here's the other part of it. Another man came with him who had had circumstances similar to Richard's. Richard was physically, he was a big man. Physically, he was a little injured from all that had happened to him. So he wasn't like an athletic young man. But he was stalwart and powerful. And this other man was just shriveled and dark and small. And they had had the same experiences. But Richard had seen it as coming from Jesus. And this man had fought against it the entire time. Now that's the desire that the Bhagavad Gita is talking about. It's not about having 2 servings of cake, or wishing to have a comfortable home where you can raise your children, or having to earn enough money to give them the education they need. That's not the desire he's talking about. The desire that binds us is the thought that I know better than God what's good for me. And it's very subtle, and it's very complicated. Just as Helen was reading today, some inspirations come from superconsciousness and some don't, but they're energized by our emotional preferences. So we can't always navigate this without mistakes. But there are very simple rules. One, if God sent it to you, it's probably something you need. That doesn't necessarily mean that we endure without creative solutions. Sometimes God sends it to us so that we'll have the nerve to stand up and say, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm going to do something else. It's not like we become passive at all. But we move always from that inward desire. Lord, what is it that you want from me? And we learn our emotional biases really are what begin to teach us this kind of discipline. I mean, think how people will discipline themselves for their children. Think how people will discipline themselves for their husbands or their wives or their siblings, or even a dear friend who's ill. Just think how powerfully we transcend ourselves when there is willingness to do it. And so what we're doing on the spiritual path is we're practicing in every single small arena. Lord, how can I serve? Swamiji talks to us about the fact that he says creativity is essential on the spiritual path. To be successful as a devotee, we must be very creative. Now that doesn't mean we have to paint or sing or anything like that, although all those things are enormously helpful because they get the juices flowing. But the real creativity is very simple. Lord, how can I serve you? In whatever circumstance, just practice that as a very simple mantra. Next time you're somewhere where you don't really want to be, you ask yourself the question, how can I serve? Just how can I serve? I know I spent the time earlier in the summer, and I'm going back again to this little town in northeastern Washington, which is not the cultural hub of the United States. And there's many individuals there who struggle just to survive a little harder than people here do. And you can see people who seem not simpatico with you, or even you want to pull back a little bit from their vibration. But you ask a very simple question, how can I serve? What can I do to help you? So the woman in the internet cafe, who's probably about my age but is still struggling clearly even to survive, has lost most of her teeth and just very crabby, just about everything that happens. You just ask the question, how can I serve? What can I give? How many people have really seen this individual today and really given them something of their own heart? Is there ever a time when that's not possible? If God didn't want this to happen, it wouldn't be happening. I remember years ago, some people very close to me were very, very suffering a great deal, and I was trying to hold it together for everybody else, and I was not capable, and I had to absent myself and give vent to my tears, and I was just gone, just completely weeping and unbearably upset. And then this thought came. It annoyed me at the time. The thought came, do you think this would be happening outside the will of God? And I didn't like that because I was in the mood to be rebellious and I was not in the mood to be lectured to. But I had to say, no, of course it couldn't. And then the same voice said to me, then why are you weeping? Well, my answer was, because I think this is terrible. All these people are suffering, I'm suffering, this is just a ghastly situation. Something needs to be done. But to demand of God that He respond to your prayer is different than telling him that his plan is off somehow. And so I took all that emotion, but I put it to, okay, if we're going to have to deal with this, then you have to get into the game and start helping us. You have to give me more strength than everyone. And that was the turning point. The whole energy began to shift from that. How many times have we felt that in ourselves or even in the world around us with that kind of force? But the force of, okay, if we're going to do this, we're really going to do it, is very different than why? You ask the same question in two different ways. One is, why are you doing this to me? And the other question is, why are you doing this to me? You know, what good thing are you trying to accomplish in my life by what I consider to be these terrible means? It's all right to express yourself honestly, but Jesus set the message perfectly. The Garden of Gethsemane, Lord, let this cup pass from me, but thy will, not mine, be done. You see, that's the honest relationship you have with God. I'm weak, I'm terrified, I really don't know how I'm going to be able to handle this. I'm sad, I'm scared, but if this is what you want, then I presume you have a plan, and let's go into it. You know, life is kind to us most of the time, but even when it's kind, we have to practice. Because then when it's not kind, we'll be ready. And that's why we incarnated, so we might as well get on with it, don't you think? God bless you.